There's something about digital synths or romplers from the 90s, that uncanny tonality and texture that's unachievable by traditional analog synths. Many people have asked me, how do I actually create that rompler pad sound? And it's actually very simple, and I'm going to show you how to recreate it just using a bunch of samplers. Let's first analyze a rompler from the 90s, and we're going to do that with the Korg Triton. The major difference between a rompler and an analog synth comes down to the oscillator. And in a rompler, the oscillators are just different samples. And these samples can be anything and everything. It could be a sample of a sawtooth wave from a Jupiter synth, or it could be something like a Mark tree. And really what we're doing in a rompler is we're stacking up different samples and running them through traditional synthesis technique, amp envelopes, filter envelopes, and then pushing them through a lot of effects. And that's where the uncanny sound comes from. Let's look at this patch here in the Korg Triton, and let's just solo the first oscillator here, which is called a DWGS bell. This sounds like something that could have come from a D50, which could have also then be sampled from some 80s analog synth. And we have that core note here, and we can play a chord with it. And that's what I would consider a more traditional sound that may be in a rompler. Then I can enable double mode here and stack that with something less traditional, maybe a real sample, something like a Mark tree, which I just did a video about. And so if we take all the processing off of the second sample here, the Mark tree, we can hear it's literally a sample of a Mark tree. But once we send it through that processing, that's where a lot of the uncanniness comes from. So to recreate that rompler sound, we're going to take two samples and put together a similar architecture to the Korg Triton. The first sound we're going to sample here is going to be a saw wave from the Jupiter 8. And then we're going to need some type of odd sample, and I'm going to go ahead and use the Mark tree from the Korg Triton for that. Now if we play these two sounds together, it's going to sound awful like this. And so I'm going to show you how we can go from this sound to that gorgeous pad sound that you've been hearing so far. What I've done here in Bitwig is created an instrument layer which lets us stack different instruments. So for Oscillator 1, I have a sampler device, and then Oscillator 2 will also be a sampler device as well. And then each sampler will play those two samples we just captured. Now I've also put some effects on the master bus here, an EQ, a chorus, and a reverb. And that's to get all of our sounds summed together and going through effects, which are such a big part of this sound. And of course, we can still have that concept of insert effects on each layer as needed. Now, here's our Jupiter 8 sound and the sampler just playing at the original pitch. If we play up on C4, it'll pitch up. If we play down, it pitches down. And then, of course, we can play a chord with this as well. Now what we need to do now is loop this up so we get a perfect loop that we can sustain out for a pad, and it should be pretty easy to do for a pretty standard wave like this. Next thing I'm going to do here is add a good bit of release on the amp envelope, and that allows us to have that more pad-like sound where the sound can fade out over time. Now what I'm going to do is think about my filter and removing some of the brightness from the sound. And so just a nice low pass filter will be perfect for that. And we can go ahead and enable that and bring it down. And so with some additional tweaking on that master effects bus, a little bit of reverb, some chorus, we have a pretty good sound right now. And now we can start to think about that Mark tree sound and how we can fit it in with that core sawtooth sound. So now I'll begin to audition the two together and see how it sounds as is. And so the Mark tree is sounding a little flat to me, so I'm going to do an insert effect here, just a little bit of a delay to help put that sound out echoing in space. And so what I did there was looped the Mark tree up as well and added a bunch of release to it too. So it has a long tail on the end of it. And then we can start thinking about some other processing here, like fading the sound in by increasing the attack on the amp envelope. And then this is a fun one here. Something you can do with the panning of just one sound is put a slow LFO on it so the Mark tree moves around. And then the other thing we're going to do with the Mark tree is put a high pass filter on it. Put that on just to get out some of the low end content and then modulate that with the same LFO as well. Now let's put a pitch shifter on the Mark tree and modulate that as well. Another great way to just create some new sound from a typical sample. And now what I'm going to do is just mess with that filter on the original sawtooth sound just to get a little more movement with a modulation on the filter cutoff through an amp envelope. And so after some tweaking with amp envelopes and effects, we're really getting towards our final sound now. And so this is really the core sound here and the core idea. So hopefully this video was helpful. Really the crux of it again is finding those two samples, shaping those sounds through things like filters, amp envelopes, use liberal amounts of effects. And once you have that final sound, you can go the old school route, bounce it down to audio, and throw it into a sampler.